All right, hello everybody. I'm Dr. Kevin Jennings, and I'm here to teach you all about criminal justice. All right, so we are going to start off with Section 1 and the first part of Section 1. This is our Introduction to Criminal Justice. So I like to start off every section with a kind of a funny picture, get us all in the right mood. So here's our first one. Forbidden by law from being a criminal. That's funny. That's really good. I really like that. Anyway, all right. So we live in a society. Of course, this course is designed for people living in the United States, but wherever you live in the world, you live in a society. That means large groups of very diverse, very different people all living together, agreeing to abide by the same rules. This process is really what made humanity what it is today, right? We couldn't have any of the technology or the medicine or the airplanes or any of that stuff. We couldn't have had any of that if we didn't first develop the concept of society the way we have. Now, in early human societies, we didn't have kind of a formal government system set up to do all the jobs that government does today. So we didn't have laws, we didn't have rules, we didn't have any kind of formal system, formal things that people had to abide by in order to get along in society. We just had these things called social norms. Okay, now social norms, we still have them today. They're kind of the unwritten rules. They're kind of the traditions we have in society that everybody kind of weirdly understands, but nobody can really remember learning them. For instance, in the world today, one of our social norms is if you step onto an elevator and there's a whole bunch of other people on that elevator, which way does everybody face? Right? I mean, think about it. If you said face towards the door,
yes,
you're right. Okay? So everybody faces towards the door. Everybody has their back to the back wall, right? Is that a rule written down anywhere? No. But if you violate that social norm and you stand facing the back of the elevator with your back to the door, you're going to get a lot of weird looks, which is kind of a very low, very simple form of an informal sanction. Okay? Informal sanctions are any kind of punishment or ostracism you face as a person for violating one of these social norms that doesn't reach the level of, the police or an official, your school principal or whoever, making some kind of, you broke a rule, here is the punishment for violating that rule judgment. Okay? Informal sanctions are just, they can be anything from weird looks to shunning to, excluding you from the in-group, things like that. So those are kind of the most basic, fundamental methods that society has for really policing the behavior of the society's members. Now, as cultures got more complicated, they got larger, it's more than just family groups living together, we started developing the process of formal sanctions, okay? Now, formal sanctions, it started with, say, the elders of the group would get together and make a council that would decide on, whether this person broke a sanction, and assaulted somebody else or stole something from somebody else or whatever. And then that process got more and more formalized. It got more and more elaborate. Went through the king gets to judge to, today we have judges and juries and stuff that get to determine those things. And we have entire books full of laws that dictate the formal sanctions you will face if you violate those laws, right? So formal sanctions are the things that, the police are going to arrest you for. If you're in a school, it's what your dean or your principal, if they say, oh, you violated this rule, here's your punishment. That is a formal sanction, okay? But all of these formal sanctions, informal sanctions, all those things, those are methods of creating social control, okay? Social control just means making sure everybody plays by the rules. Because that's what we want in society, right? That's a really, really important thing in society, is to make sure that everybody plays by those same rules. And when you're in very small groups, when it's just, say, an extended family unit, there's 20 of you, you're all related, you're all kind of, out living somewhere in the middle of nowhere, trying to get by, hunting, fishing, gathering, all that stuff. That's relatively easy to do. But the larger, more complex your society gets, you need to have more of these methods of social control in order to have a society that functions well. Because the kind of the less we know our neighbors, the more we're going to be okay with violating those social norms or those, formal laws and stuff in order to help ourselves at the expense of that neighbor we don't know, right? So what societies need more or less social control? It really comes down to size and complexity. The larger your group, the more social control you need, okay? So, if we're on some island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean and there's only 20 or 30 of us, we don't need a lot of social control, right? Whereas the modern United States has what, 320, 330 million people? We're going to need a lot of social control in order to make sure that everybody follows the rules. As, you turn on the news and you can see that every day. The other thing is more complex, right? So there are some societies where, even today, 2018, there are some societies where the vast majority of the people kind of, they're all of the same race, they're all of the same religion, they're all of the same culture. There's very little incoming and outgoing influence, whether that's cultural, religious, whatever. Whereas in other areas, such as the United States, there's a lot of different peoples, a lot of different cultures, a lot of different religions, a lot of different everything that are coming together. And that's a great thing. Don't get me wrong. I love the fact that in the United States we have, African Americans, we have white people, we have Asians, we have all kinds of different groups all coming together and living together. But that creates kind of a social strife where we need to kind of spend a little more time on social control and be like, all right, look, everybody's different. Your neighbor might be a completely different culture than you're used to. But we all need to still play by the same rules. All right, guys, right? So the more heterogeneous the culture, the more kind of social control you need, which is kind of, Anyway, so where did this all come from? It started really with the Enlightenment, so in the Enlightenment, there was this guy named Locke. Well, Locke was one of many of these philosophers or thinkers or people who started talking about what are the rights of humankind, okay? Because prior to this, all through medieval, even back to Roman and pre-Roman days, it was really, the people didn't really have a lot of rights. It was just the powerful ruled and the weak followed. But finally in the Enlightenment, they started figuring out that no, even the most normal, the most, the lowliest peasant deserves some kind of rights. He has humanity. They deserve some kind of recognition and some kind of special treatment just for being a person. Okay, and this was just the very beginning of this process. And so there came a debate about how do you balance the rights of individuals on the one hand versus social control on the other, right? Because we could have perfect social control. We could make sure everybody follows the rules. But to do that, we would have to violate everybody's rights. We would have to completely toss out even the concept of individual rights. On the other hand, we could give everybody infinite amount of individual rights. You have all the rights in the world. You only have to choose whatever you want. But that would be completely disastrous for social order, right? I mean, if I had the personal right to walk out and take my neighbor's car, I mean, that would be disastrous for social order. So it really started back in the Enlightenment, this balancing act between what rights of humanity should we recognize versus what do we have to do to maintain social control, and how do we balance those two sometimes in opposition concepts, right? So in the United States, one of our big groups where this balancing act has to take place is the Supreme Court, right? Here in the United States, we have a Supreme Court. It's got 9 justices on it, and they get to decide these really complex, really difficult court cases, right? If they're simple and easy to decide, the Supreme Court doesn't see them. Those get solved at levels well below the Supreme Court. So in the Supreme Court and in the kind of the modern American legal sense, instead of rights versus order, we start talking about due process versus crime control. Okay? Due process is the name we've given to, we need to recognize individual rights. We need to make sure that this person, his right to search and seizure, his right to stay silent, all these things, we need to make sure that those rights from that person are not violated. On the other hand, we have the crime control side, which is we need to maintain social order. Crime is causing people to die. It's causing people to lose money. It's causing all these social ills. Let's make sure that we can maintain that social control, and we can kind of control that crime. Okay, so that's kind of, it's the same debate that's been happening since the Enlightenment, but we've just changed the name of it. So today it's due process versus crime control, and there was a huge shift towards the due process side of this under a guy named Earl Warren. Okay, Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for a long time. He came in and he was one of the 9 Supreme Court justices, and under his watch, they really did do a massive shift towards the due process side and towards saying, look, we need to make sure that the rights of individuals are not being violated. Okay, one of the big famous cases that his court oversaw was Miranda v. Arizona. Okay, now Miranda v. Arizona is a very famous case, and I forget the exact details of the case, but something happened. This guy named Miranda got arrested for something. I don't even remember what crime it was, but he got arrested for something, and he got taken back to the police station, and they started questioning him. And he didn't realize that he had the right to remain silent. He didn't realize he could just say, just not talk and say, I want my lawyer. And because of that, the interrogation went on and on, and he eventually confessed to the crime. Now, he got convicted of that crime based on that confession, and his lawyer said, wait a minute, like, my client didn't know that he had a Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. So they appealed it, went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, you know what, you're right. You are absolutely right. Your client did not know he had that Fifth Amendment right to remain silent. So from now on, we want every arresting police officer to tell every single person they arrest that they have the right to remain silent. Okay? And now think about it. I'm sure you guys have watched Cops or some other, TV show where people are getting arrested. And after the police officer arrests them, what do they always say? Right? You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney will be provided for you free of charge. Do you understand these rights? That is called the Miranda warning because of this case, Miranda v. Arizona. Right? So this guy, Miranda, didn't know he had these rights. He goes to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court says, you know what, you're right. You should have known about those rights. And now every police officer in the country has to read this list of rights to everyone they arrest before they interrogate them. That is a very important due process right that you have today, assuming you're living in the United States, because of this due process versus crime control balancing act. Okay? So we're going to come back next time and we're going to talk a little bit more about the introduction to criminal justice.